What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. I am very excited to be joined today by Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition. Danny, how you doing, my man?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thank you so much for asking me on the show.
Yeah, man, it's my pleasure. So recently, you've been conducting a very thought-provoking series on the ethics of veganism and omnivorism. Like we kind of talked about before the show started, this truly is my favorite series right now in regards to podcasts for exercise science and nutrition. And it's really gotten me to think more critically about my current diet. I eat meat. I've always eaten meat. And I've never really took the time to take a step back and really look at the morality of my diet, so to speak. And I've had multiple discussions about this concept with my girlfriend, who also has a degree in nutrition. And basically, when I look at the points about the reasons why I eat meat, it just comes down to convenience or preference, and more or less just selfish reasons. And as far as my personal ethical beliefs, it kind of bothers me, and I kind of deem these positions to be insufficient, especially with having a background in nutrition. I know I could construct a well-planned lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet and not miss a beat when it comes to hypertrophy outcomes. So this is really, kind of persuaded me to maybe think about making a transition towards a more plant-based approach or consuming less meat. And ultimately, I think that many physique athletes can transition towards a more plant-based approach and not risk anything in terms of muscle hypertrophy. But I do think the equation gets a little more complex if we're talking strictly in terms of veganism. And that's ultimately why I have you here today to discuss some of those nutrients of concern for vegan or vegetarian athletes. But before we dive into some of those concepts, I am super curious, Danny. How has your diet changed at all since conducting this series?
Yeah, so I think I'm was in a very similar position to you, Mike, that my food choices all along have generally been based around not only taste, but from a nutritional science perspective. So my background is in nutritional science. I have a big interest in athletic performance, how I was doing in the gym, playing sports. And so my nutrition approach has been very much reflective of that. And so given that including animal products in the diet can give us a variety of different nutrients and is a very convenient source of protein, which is obviously a big concern when we're talking about athletic endeavors, or just typically when we think about good sources of protein, we're going to be typically thinking of animal produce. So for that reason, I've only viewed it through that lens. And so this is the first time I've really deeply reflected on what are the moral and ethical arguments on either side. And the series was just a way for me to explore that by talking to people who have thought deeply in this area of ethics and moral philosophy. And like you say, the arguments can be quite persuasive, but even more than that, for what it led to me to think is, if I'm going to continue with my normal diet, I need to have a very strong argument for that. And so in lieu of not being able to put a really strong argument for some of those choices I was making, in short, yes, there has been a shift, I would say. And that probably started as I started thinking about this. And then as the series went on, being exposed to more of these ideas gave me that nudge to maybe make some different distinctions or try some different things. So I have gone through periods of trialing like a strict vegan diet for maybe like 3 or 4 weeks or so to get to grips to, well, how pragmatic is this? And does this fit in with being able to do all the things I want to do? And then I would say right now, probably the best way to, if someone was going to put a label on my diet, which isn't always that super useful, probably some sort of flexitarian / pescatarian type approach, where I've definitely reduced my overall consumption of red meat, I would say, and probably animal meat in general, where I get a lot of my protein sources from, say, fish. I have that much more often now. I will rely still on something like a whey protein. So I'm still having some dairy in the diet. So it's definitely more on a vegetarian, pescatarian type side. But when I go and visit family, for example, if my mother has cooked a family dinner that includes some meat, I'm still at a point where I'm still consuming that. And so again, that that current diet that I currently have isn't one that I would say is purely based on ethics or what I've learned through the series. I would say I'm still processing some of that. And so that is subject to change. And I am still thinking through a lot of those concepts. But currently, that's how my diet is looking. So in short, yeah, it's caused some reflection. But as I think I mentioned to you before, it's more than anything, it's made me think about where this food is coming from. And I think there are ethical concerns just beyond what the food is, but also how it was produced, where it came from. Is this from someone that is going to benefit? How is it produced? All those types of questions. So that's kind of the answer to what I'm currently doing.
Very cool. I do appreciate you sharing that with us, Danny. So let's jump into the topics for today, starting with, I guess, the most important when it comes to physique athletes, and that is protein. Real quick, just to set some context for everyone, when we refer to veganism, that's the exclusion of all animal products. And when we say vegetarian, we're going to be referring to not consuming any animal flesh. So this would be lacto-ovo-vegetarian. They do not consume any fish. So if we look at vegans and vegetarians, and we go by the concept that around 2.2 grams per kg per day of protein is probably the upper range, which we can be absolutely sure we're maximizing the benefits from protein for muscle mass. But I guess my general question is for you, Danny, is that does this still apply for a vegan diet which does not contain complete sources of protein in comparison to animal sources? Plant sources tend to possess lower levels of leucine, a critical amino acid for stimulating MPS. So with those ideas in mind, is 2.2 grams per kg per day a sufficient recommendations for vegans, or perhaps they need to target a little bit higher?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think we can try and answer this by looking at what kind of broad scale recommendations we have, some of the research, and some of that may indicate that once you get at that higher level of protein intake, you can actually probably maximize muscle or muscle development even from plant sources. However, when we think of that mechanistically, what's going on, we may need to be take more attention over to what those meals actually look like and what protein sources are making up our protein intake. And I think there is a fair case that on a per dose basis, so per meal, that if you're getting it purely from plant sources, you may need more protein per meal. And so you touched on two of the reasons here. One, when we look at the research around muscle protein synthesis and food sources, what's typically referred to as a high protein or a high quality protein is a animal-based protein because of the amino acid profile. So we can look at things like the digestibility of the amino acids there, if it has the full complement of those essential amino acids, which you mentioned. And then primarily we're looking at the leucine content. So I'm sure you've discussed before about leucine is the primary amino acid that initiates that muscle protein synthetic response. And so animal products tend to be relatively high in leucine. And for example, it's why whey is often used as a post-workout supplement, because whey has the highest amount of leucine typically of most sources per serving. Now, if you look at most plant-derived proteins, you tend to see a relatively lower amount of leucine. So if we need around, let's say, 2.5 grams plus of leucine per meal for the average person to maximize that muscle protein synthesis response, getting that purely from a plant-based source of protein may require a larger serving of protein total for that reason. And so that may, at least for the physique athlete who is really trying to cross every T, dot every I, they probably would want to pay attention to making sure they get more protein per meal if they were going with a plant-based diet. Now, there are other options available, like they could supplement with some leucine or some branched-chain amino acids alongside that meal to bump up that leucine content and get their other amino acids from the meal they're consuming with plant-based proteins. So overall, I would say you're probably looking at somewhere, it doesn't have to be dramatically higher, but looking at things instead on a per meal basis and what is the likely essential amino acid and leucine content of this meal, and making sure you're getting enough from that, regardless of what source you are choosing.
So you touched on a couple of pretty important points there that I want to explore a little bit further. So for the first part, if we don't take into consideration an amino acid supplement, and we're just looking at plant sources at the meal, for physique athletes, how important would you say it is to make sure you're combining plant sources to create a complete amino acid profile? I mean, based on some of the reading I've done, it seems that the concept that you need to combine sources at each meal is kind of out of date, and that as long as you're consuming a wide variety of plant sources throughout the day, you're good to go. But while this might be sufficient for, general health, I'm unsure that, this wouldn't matter for a physique athlete. So what are your thoughts about the importance of combining plant sources at meals?
Yeah, so I think you're right, and you accurately summarized that the current position that I think is probably the consensus right now would be that combining protein sources in each meal is unnecessary, and rather we can take a longer term view that if your overall diet has a variety of different types of plant-based proteins, you're probably completely fine, and you're not going to have a deficiency of one of those amino acids. And it's not that every meal needs to have the full complement of amino acids. So I'm pretty confident in that conclusion. I think there was a paper by Molina, maybe 2016, which is a really good summary of this particular, or made this point. I think there is the specific context of the physique athlete. Like you say, we're not just generally looking about getting enough protein to function. We have very specific reasons for consuming protein. Now, again, if at that moment of the meal we're getting a sufficient amount of leucine, let's say, then I would see no reason why we need to have every other amino acid in that specific meal, as long as there's enough across the day and there's going to be enough in that amino acid pool. Now, again, that's just my sense of it. I haven't seen anything that would lead me to believe you need to have complete protein sources at every meal in order to maximize muscle protein. I just haven't seen that. So my kind of current focus for those types of athletes would still be around leucine content, then second to that, the essential amino acid content. But again, it depends on what does their meals look like across the day. If they're going to be eating it again in 2 hours, like how much difference is it going to make? These are questions that are interesting, but I don't know if I have a real definitive answer to. Apart from right now, it's not something I would spend a lot of time focusing on. Again, just thinking about, are they getting enough protein total? And are they getting enough leucine? And oftentimes, if you're getting enough protein per meal, once they work that out, then we can almost guarantee there's enough leucine once that's worked out on one or two occasions. So yeah, that's where I tend to fall on the complete protein issue.
If someone was interested in investing in some sort of amino acid supplement, just to ensure that they're covering all of their bases here, where would you advise them to put that money? Would it be just towards solely a leucine supplement, or would a branched chain amino acid or an essential amino acid supplement be better?
If they're doing it for the reason of to consume alongside a normal meal, just to bolster up some of those amino acids that relate to that hypertrophic response, then I think all three of those options would essentially do the same thing. I would tend to typically go with an essential amino acid over a branched chain amino acid because you're going to get those BCAAs anyway. It tends to be more cost effective, which again is probably just a product of supplement marketing, that people value BCAAs more than a essential amino acid supplement. So then that would be a way to cover your bases of those essential amino acids anyway, because if you're having it alongside a meal, you don't need dramatic amounts of leucine. But that said, just a leucine supplement alone, if that is the goal. So depending on what the goal of the supplementation was, if it's simply to boost up leucine levels, then really any of those options will work. So maybe go with the most cost effective and just dose kind of accordingly.
Great. So with those ideas in mind, I think it's appropriate to kind of transition into some unique circumstances and perhaps looking at some practical application here. So when it comes to physique athletes and we consider the situation of contest prep where calories are ultimately going to become severely restricted, protein needs in general are going to increase, let alone if you're following a vegan diet, they might even be higher. So with those things being said, for a vegan athlete in contest prep, what would be your general recommendation for how they can go about maximizing the retention of muscle while not exceeding their calories?
Yeah, and this tends to be one of the trickier issues, given that if we think of the most common protein sources that are recommended in most vegan communities, if people are going on online forums to try and look for examples, or even if they Google different articles, you'll typically see things like lentils, kidney beans, chickpeas, and so on, which again do contribute protein, but they have also are very high in carbohydrate. They're a greater source of carbohydrate than they are protein typically for those. So trying to rely on those just for protein intake can lead to that problem that you suggest, that by the time you're getting enough protein, you also have a huge carbohydrate and therefore calorie intake. So a couple of options that may be useful would be things like tofu would be one, where you can have something that's mainly protein. I think it's probably going to come to, or at least if I was doing it purely, again, it could be for convenience, but it makes sense to me to use some sort of vegan protein powder. Again, because it gives you another option where you have a source of protein that doesn't have that high intake of carbohydrate and calories alongside it. There are some options for different types of vegan yogurts and things that you can find now, depending on what they're made from and the brand and so on. Some may be better than others. So trying to find things like that would be the way forward. But I think particularly for a contest prep scenario where calories are going to have to reach a point where they get very low, then some degree of supplementation just makes sense to me, unless someone has a real philosophical problem with using supplements, let's say. That way you have to be a bit more creative, and you would have to rely on things like a tofu or tempeh or things like this.
In regards to supplements, nowadays we have a variety of options for vegans, and some of those include things like soy protein or rice protein, pea protein, even hemp seed protein. Which of these would probably be the best bet to pursue?
I think the soy proteins have actually pretty decent data on them in terms of their potential or how they stack up against some other types of protein powders. Personally, I think pea protein has a really good amino acid profile. I tend to like that as well. And I think there's now options where you can get flavored pea protein powders that are actually pretty palatable. For a long time, the main issue with a lot of the vegan protein powders was they're just not palatable at all, just not nice. And I think you definitely still find this with hemp powder, depending again on the brand or if it's flavored or not. But even those are rapidly improving. I think now also it may be a good option to go with some sort of blend. So you see some of the popular brands doing a blend of rice and pea, for example. And again, those can taste pretty good. So I would tend to go with something that's just personally a pea protein powder or a pea and rice blend. I think probably hemp doesn't seem to have as good a amino acid profile if we're purely thinking about muscle synthesis. So that's where I would go.
Moving to the other side of the coin, let's talk a little bit about the off season for bodybuilders, where energy needs are typically pretty darn high in this population. And some potential concerns when it comes to being a vegan athlete is just the strong satiating effects of the diet, mostly through, a high food volume, high total fiber intake. What would be some general recommendations for these athletes to meet their energy demands, and if they are experiencing any gastrointestinal distress from the increased food during the off season?
Right. This is a really good question. I think it's if someone hasn't paid attention to it, they would run into this wall pretty quickly because, as you say, one of the most common things you see when someone just begins a plant-based or a vegan diet is you tend to see a reduction in calories, or you tend to see very high levels of satiation. For that reason, you said that it has high food volume for a low calorie density. It has a very high intake of fiber. Again, if we're presuming that the person is getting most of their food sources from good quality whole foods mostly, as opposed to just going on a junk food diet, but that's just vegan versions of that, which is entirely possible now. You can just get vegan pizzas and vegan ice cream all day. But presuming that someone's doing it sensible, you have this high intake of fiber. And again, if someone goes from their normal intake to a very high intake of fiber, that can cause some of these gastrointestinal distress symptoms that you mentioned. So I think the way is just to reverse engineer all those issues. So what are we trying to focus on? Rather than on something with low caloric density, can we find food sources with a high caloric density? Can we find sources that are relatively lower in fiber? That if we add these in, we can bulk up those calorie requirements without having any increase in the fiber or massive increase in food volume. So good options here would be maybe you're a bit more liberal in your use of olive oil on salads, for example, or you're going to use more avocados at breakfast where you otherwise wouldn't, or you put half an avocado in with your smoothie. Maybe you use a smooth nut butter in a smoothie, or a few spoons of that as opposed to using whole nuts, let's say. So trying to find calorie dense sources of those plant-based foods, which are typically those higher fat options, and putting them in place or on top of those ones that tend to be those lower calorie density options. So things like oils and nut butters, things like that tend to be probably a good go-to choice for those vegan athletes trying to increase calorie intake.
Fantastic. So I think that kind of covers it for our practical application in protein. And our next macronutrient of concern is the omega-3 fatty acid, an essential fatty acid. So when it comes to vegans and vegetarians, are these populations able to get a sufficient amount of omega-3 through dietary sources alone? And if they're not able to, what would be your recommendation in regards to supplementation?
Yeah, and this is one where there's probably a bit more nuance and still some maybe disagreement between people, in that theoretically, yes, a vegan can get omega-3 and it's in the form of ALA. Whereas if we're getting it directly from, say, sources of fish, we'd be getting EPA and DHA, which are those components that we really want to target. Now, ALA can be converted into EPA and DHA. And so it is possible for a vegan to get that from sources like chia seeds or walnuts or flaxseed and so on. Now, the issue is that conversion rates tend to be pretty poor within the body. And this has been noted for the longest time. And I think pretty much anyone that's looked into nutritional science or dietetics is the first thing that they notice about these plant sources, or the first thing they'll learn about omega-3 with vegans is that we have this poor conversion. So one option is just to get more of that ALA and just accept that there's going to be a poor conversion of it. And so in theory, yes, it is possible. Is it as good as getting a direct source of, say, DHA? maybe not, and then you could definitely make the argument, definitely at some stage of the life course. But for adults, it's probably you probably can have a fine omega-3 status, but there also may be a benefit to getting a direct source of some of that EPA and DHA. And we know, for example, some of the algae supplements that are now popular that vegans can use, where you can get omega-3 derived from algae, and they're very readily available and maybe a very convenient way to make sure they're getting enough within the diet. So it's definitely possible from those sources, but again, conversion tends to be quite poor. Conversion can also differ from person to person, so that kind of muddies the waters a bit as well. But for adults, it's probably likely that they can do once they pay enough attention to that. That said, for some people, there may be a benefit to some supplementation as well.
For those who do consume dairy and eggs, do you think it's worth the while to purchase enriched eggs or milk with omega-3?
Yeah, I think that could be a perfectly fine strategy if it fits within their normal budget and it doesn't make any real difference to them. Then using something that's going to bump up that intake seems like a perfectly reasonable strategy, or at the very least doesn't seem to come with any real downsides, potentially, like I say, apart from something practical like the cost effectiveness of that. But yeah, that would seem like a viable strategy, I think.
Cool. So moving on into micronutrients, let's start with vegetarians here, because I think there's a little bit more to discuss when it comes to vegans. But for a vegetarian who's still consuming dairy and eggs, are there any micronutrients of major concern that they might not be getting through their diet?
Well, the main one that we know, and we'll come to specifically with vegans, and obviously the issue around B12, that can sometimes be a bit lower in vegetarians as well, although certainly not to the same degree. But it does seem to be, on the average, their B12 status a bit lower than omnivores, so it may be worth paying attention to that. Now, again, depending on what someone's diet looks like, they may be getting plenty of that. And I think for someone, for example, who includes milk, typically most milks are going to come fortified with nutrients like B12 anyway. And the same with breakfast cereals. So they may be perfectly fine. That's something just to keep an eye out for. I think ones that are that we definitely see suboptimal intakes in, or at least there is pause to reflect on, would be things like zinc and iron. So with those minerals, you have the Institute of Medicine, for example, will suggest that vegetarians might need to get 50% more zinc than a non-vegetarian, and the same for iron. And that typically relates to things like the bioavailability around zinc that comes within plant-based foods. So there is some data that I've been made aware of that the body does seem to have a capacity to adapt to some of these lower intakes of zinc, by just reducing the losses and of zinc from the body and being able to increase absorption when it does come in. So it's not entirely clear that vegetarians will definitely have a problem with it, but there's at least some data suggesting they may have a lower zinc status. Now, typically, I don't think the answer is zinc supplementation. There is potential downside to a high dose zinc supplementation chronically. So I think it's definitely just more worth paying attention to, can I get some, or am I getting a varied diet that's going to give me an appropriate amount of zinc? The same with iron. I don't think necessarily it mandates supplementation, but rather just being wary that there's differences in the iron that they would consume from meat versus that they're going to get from plant-based sources. And so just making sure that there's getting a appropriate amount of that iron is the way to go. So those would be the two that I would typically come to mind first for a vegetarian.
And so we touched on iron and zinc there, and you mentioned that B12 is probably more of a concern for for vegans. Are there any other micronutrients for vegans that they have to worry about specifically that vegetarians really don't have to pay much attention to?
Um, I think probably calcium is a good one, in that if you are consuming a lot of milk from dairy, let's say, you're probably getting plenty of calcium, whereas that can be a problematic nutrient for some vegans depending on what they include. Now, they can get that from things like kale or other greens like pak choi, for example, almonds, and so on. Then when you look at plant milks, some of them now are fortified with calcium, some are not. So again, that distinction may depend on whether someone needs to consume more or less of those other types of sources. So again, depending on the diet that and what foods are making up that vegan diet, the calcium intake may be suboptimal. Because of that reduction in dairy products, whereas a lacto-ovo vegetarian will be consuming cheese and milk and yogurt, for example. So that would be one that I definitely think vegans may need to pay attention to. That wouldn't be an issue for someone that's including dairy, let's say.
So, considering the primary sources of calcium in a vegan diet, which are mostly green leafy vegetables, like you mentioned, these food items also contain oxalate or an anti-nutrient, right, that affects the bioavailability of it. How concerned should vegans be with something like this, or just anti-nutrients in general? Is there really any like potential negative health consequences, or is it more so this just means you're probably gonna have to increase your intake of certain vitamins and minerals to account for that?
Yeah, this is actually a really good point, and this is one that vegans may have mentioned to them if they're working with a dietitian, let's say, when it comes to iron status. So as I said, it's certainly possible to get iron from a vegan diet, and you may not need to supplement at all. But that distinction between the non-heme iron and heme iron would mean that we have not only a difference in the absorption there, but we also have components within a vegan diet that may disrupt the absorption of that. So, for example, some polyphenols that you would get in tea and coffee, so these tannins, they can be dietary inhibitors of iron. You mentioned phytates, which we know are going to be present in whole grains and legumes. So again, much higher intakes usually of legumes and whole grains on a vegan diet. And so those can be potentially inhibiting to our intake of iron. So just being aware of that may necessitate, like the Institute of Medicine said, making sure just to get a bit more iron within the diet. I don't think it's worth being overly obsessive about it, that if I'm having a good source of iron at this meal, I can't have any beans or grains, for example. But there may be maybe if iron status is low, then maybe more attention could be placed on that. The other thing that a vegan could do would be to have a source of vitamin C when they're consuming some of those iron-rich foods, because that may help with their iron absorption from that meal. So there are things like that interact, but for the average person just trying to increase their intake, I'm not sure how much they need to worry themselves about consuming some of those foods, unless we're pretty sure that their iron status is problematic.
So, Danny, what you're saying is, despite what the carnivore crowd might report, anti-nutrients in plants won't kill you.
They will not kill you. And I certainly probably don't agree with much of what the carnivore crowd say, to be honest.
But that's a whole nother podcast episode, I guess,
It
right?
is indeed. Right.
So for a third topic, I kind of want to get into performance supplements. So just as a broad opening question for this category, are there any popular performance supplements which you would recommend even more so for vegetarian and vegan athletes?
Yeah. So I think probably across the board, regardless, the performance supplement we have the most data on, and that has a marked impact on most people's performance, is creatine. And creatine, from a whilst so from a dietary perspective, we can get creatine from things like red meat and poultry and fish. So that for that reason, we tend to see lower creatine stores within vegan and vegetarians. So their muscle stores of creatine tend to be lower. Now, even for someone who is an omnivore, if they're not taking creatine supplementation, they probably haven't maxed out those creatine stores within the muscle, hence why we can get a benefit from taking a supplement, that we can actually get doses of creatine that will saturate those creatine stores that we just wouldn't be able to get even if we were eating red meat. We would have to eat pounds of it, let's say. So, but with that said, the baseline level of those muscle creatine stores tends to be lower in vegan and vegetarian athletes. And so if anything, by supplementing with creatine, they get even a greater boost in performance because they're coming from a lower baseline. So there's a clear, consistent benefit to taking creatine for sports performance across the board. This probably relates to majority of people. There are maybe some people that are non-responders, but for most people, there's a benefit to taking it. It's a very cost-effective supplement to take. There's no safety concerns around the supplement, no matter what people may hear on the internet. And then there's also interesting stuff on a health side where we're starting to see emerging research look at this in tackling things like sarcopenia or even in neurological disorders. And we're starting to see potential for, could this be used for benefit there? But from an athletic perspective, I'd say a creatine supplement is one that can definitely play a role. Same thing if you look at things like beta-alanine and carnosine. Those are also sources that would probably be lower for vegans and vegetarians. And so for those that are trying to maximize things from an athletic standpoint, there may be benefit to doing that.
For beta-alanine in particular, I think for, intermittent sports in general, the data is kind of clear. And as you mentioned, there are probably concerns when it comes to vegan and vegetarian athletes. But for resistance exercise in general, beta-alanine supplementation, in my opinion, the data is kind of wishy-washy. But do you think it does become potentially more beneficial for vegans and vegetarians who are concerned with physique outcomes?
I would probably tend to agree with you that it's not something that I would really push most people who are just, let's say, training for hypertrophy and are going to the gym, that I'm going to say you're going to get a profound benefit or maybe even any benefit to using this. Like you say, because of the action of beta-alanine, if someone was like some of the MMA athletes we work with or some of the endurance athletes, they would see benefits to it. But I'm really not that confident that there's going to be any profound impact on someone's performance in the gym if they're doing strength training. So it's not something we recommend to our powerlifters. Hey, you need to go and take beta-alanine, right? It's something that's definitely, like you say, more of a concern for those that are doing high intensity, intermittent type field sports or endurance activities.
Are there any other ergogenic aids or supplements that could enhance performance in the vegan and vegetarian population that you wouldn't traditionally recommend for an omnivore?
Typically, I mean, there is the discussion people could have around directly supplementing with carnosine, for example. But that is kind of the same conversation around beta-alanine. So beta-alanine is just a precursor of carnosine synthesis. So, and carnosine is something that we're going to get from animal produce, and it's not really contained in plant foods. So that's the same type of conversation. So it's, again, has this buffering capacity. So for those types of athletes, that may be something that they could look at. But beyond that and creatine, there's nothing really that I think that I would say you need to be doing, or at least nothing's coming to mind. But maybe I'm pulling a blank on that one.
I have a bit more specific question for you then. I recently saw some data about probiotic supplementation increasing the absorption of pea protein. Have you seen any other studies replicating this finding or see any potential efficacy of this approach to increase the digestibility and absorption of plant sources of protein?
So I haven't seen that particular study you mentioned around probiotic supplementation. And certainly at this point, the use of probiotics as a method to increase digestion of certain foods is not something that I've typically recommended to people because of just a lack of awareness around data in that area. Now, I'd be happy to change that as stuff comes out, but yeah, it's not something that I've typically done for that reason. But yeah, purely because it's not an area of research that I've seen enough on.
Alrighty. Anything else you want to touch on in regards to the potential for supplementation here?
No, I think that though most of those would be the way to cover people's bases. Like I said, I think from a health perspective, really you're only looking at B12 as the one I would see it as like mandatory supplementation for a vegan athlete, because the others can be covered within the dietary context, albeit with some degree of attention paid to them. So it's not to say that some benefits of supplementation couldn't be had, but just it's not necessarily necessary in order to function in the same way that we would mandate that B12 supplementation should be done. I mean, there could be attention paid to vitamin D, but that is something that would probably go across the board for non-vegan athletes just as well. That, especially in my area of the world, I'm in Ireland right now, and we are in the middle of our supposed summer, and it's just grey skies and rain this week. So when you live in an area of the world like that, then vitamin D supplementation is a very important issue. So for people who are living at latitudes where they don't get a lot of sun and outdoor exposure throughout the year, then vitamin D can be beneficial. Even in athletic context, we're starting to see the benefit of vitamin D supplementation for muscle function, for example. So that would be one that may be worth mentioning. But from a supplementation point of view, I think, yeah, we've covered quite a good few there.
Awesome. So our last topic for today is that a lot of people might want to follow a vegan or vegetarian approach simply for ethical reasons. But in regards to performance, is there anything to gain by following one of these diets for an athlete, or are we really just concerned with mitigating potential decrements in performance that can occur from following this diet?
So I think I'll answer it in two ways. One, directly, and then indirectly. So indirectly, is there a superiority for a vegan diet over a non-vegan diet for performance? I would say the evidence-based answer is no. There's number one, there's no data to suggest that's superior. And then two, there would be no plausible mechanism by why it should be, because everything you can eat on a vegan diet, the non-vegan can also eat that, but we can add in things like salmon, which has the omega-3, which may be of benefit. We can have more convenient source of protein. We can have those protein sources after training. It make it a bit easier to eat, get those protein in. And at the very least, we can get other sources of micronutrients, right? So at the very least, the non-vegan diet has to be at least on par with a vegan diet in terms of athletic performance, because there's nothing that we're missing out on. There's nothing extra that the vegan diet is giving. Now, is there an indirect benefit for a given individual going on a vegan diet? Then you could say, yes, there is. So if we took an example where someone said, hey, I went on a vegan diet 3 months ago, and now I'm performing better than ever. I'm a cross-country runner. Well, for that person, maybe the vegan diet was what allowed them to drop an extra 2 or 3 kilos that they'd never done before. They were able to under-eat calories. They were able, without being super hungry. They lost some body fat, and they're now 2 to 3 kilos lighter. And now they're going to perform better, again, if they're an endurance athlete. We could see the same thing for other sports that are where someone saw a benefit for their body composition. Similarly, if you took someone who went on a vegan diet, but now that also led to an increase in their food quality. So before they went on the vegan diet, they weren't really paying attention to their diet. It was kind of like not so great, lots of processed foods. Now they get really interested in veganism, go to a vegan diet and start getting fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains into their diet. Their fiber intake suddenly goes up. Their intake of micronutrients goes up. They become healthier. And then they therefore get a benefit for performance because now they've got more energy, they're feeling better. Then, yeah, there could be a plausible benefit there. And then third one that's been mentioned to me recently is that if you have someone who really gets a psychological benefit from being on this diet because it fits in with their philosophy and their set of values that they want to live their life by, and now they feel that they're living in accordance with those, and now they psychologically feel in a better place. And then this has a knock-on impact on other areas of their life related to their physical health and their physical performance, perhaps, right? So there's all these indirect ways it could make could be beneficial, but on a strictly directly impact in the way that some documentaries may indicate, there's nothing to suggest that if an athlete wants to perform at their best, you must be on a vegan diet, and that you're at a detriment by not being. If someone chooses to be on an omnivorous diet, then they can be just as successful in their sport as if they were on a vegan diet. So it's not to mandate that you need to be on this type of diet in order to perform.
Yeah, you touched on something really important there, which I think if we spin this question a bit differently, is that what do athletes have to gain from becoming more plant-based in their dietary approach? And I think everyone knows that from an overall health perspective, fruits and vegetables are good for you. Even with that being said, I run into numerous athletes who have a very low consumption of fruits and vegetables per day, unfortunately. Some more potential reasons why this could increase athletic performance. What do you think about maybe through incorporating more plants, you're getting more of these unique plant compounds, polyphenols, perhaps that could lead to an increase in recovery? Or we have this very recent paper that came out about the gut muscle axis that seems to be coming to surface, and how maybe eating more plants and a higher fiber diet could bolster the gut microbiome, and that has a positive effect on muscle. What do you think in terms of these concepts, or anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think they're both very, very valid points that you make. And this could also extend just to general health benefits beyond athletic performance, that you see the same reasons that many people will report anecdotally that they benefited from going on a vegan diet, let's say. And this actually extends to any other type of diet. We see the same type of reports. And oftentimes it's not just that they went on this diet, it's compared to what. So like you outlined, if someone now shifts to a vegan diet, but before they were getting a very low intake of fiber, and now they're getting a optimal or high intake of fiber, there's probably going to be some benefit to their gut health, their overall health, that will translate then into maybe helping their performance. There's also then, they don't usually consume fruits and vegetables. Now they consume a huge amount. So they're getting all these antioxidants and polyphenols that have benefits for recovery. And as a kind of example of that, recently on the podcast, I was talking to Eric Drexler, and we were talking about the benefits of different supplements. Whether you look at, if you take something like nitrates, for example, and an athlete will happily take that as a supplement, but when you tell them, hey, get some more beetroot in your diet, like, no one does that. But you clearly see a benefit for food sources of various nutrients, including polyphenols, versus isolated supplement sources of it, because it comes with all this other good stuff. And I think the same thing happens here, that, as you say, if we switch an athlete over to consuming more fruits and vegetables, it's hard to get them to do it just to say, eat more fruit and veg. But now if they're having this total shift in their whole diet, and especially when there's this identity placed around that veganism, or now I'm vegan, or et cetera, or I do it for these ethical reasons, and they really buy into it, there's a much stronger likelihood they're going to adhere to those principles and stay consuming more of those fruits and vegetables. And actually, there's a recent paper out of Australia that showed that having that identity and labeling of part of their diet allowed for greater adherence to a dietary approach. And I think that's why it may be more successful in getting athletes to consume an overall healthy dietary pattern. So it's more about what the diet is allowing them to include as opposed to what it's getting them to exclude. So their performance is improving because they're now including all these fruits and vegetables and fiber and so on, as opposed to the fact that they're no longer drinking milk, right?
Fantastic. All right, Danny, that's all I have for you today. For people who want to learn more about you and connect with you, where should they go to find you?
Awesome. So probably the easiest place is sigmanutrition.com, SIGMA. Or if they like listening to podcasts, the podcast is sigmanutrition.com, Sigma Nutrition Radio. It's on any podcast app. And then I'm also on social media. So Instagram, Danny Lennon _Sigma, and then Twitter is Nutrition Danny. So any of those places is cool.
What do we have cooking as far as content goes? I know you've discussed a paper on the nutritional considerations for vegan diets. We have that to look forward to, correct?
Yes, so that should be out in around this time. Myself and Alan Flanagan, who works with me at Sigma, talking about some of the nutritional science and going into some of the interventions of comparing vegan diets and other diets, and just trying to tease apart the health outcomes and nutritional science aspect to those diets. So that should be next on the agenda for the podcast.
Very cool. All right, everyone. That does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Per usual, you can find the video content for this episode on YouTube, and we are also available on all major streaming platforms. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher Radio. Thanks, everyone.